Welcome to those tuning into the Camera On initiative. Today we turn the camera on to some topical issues, mental health, momentum and goal setting. I'm Cameron Norton, and today with me I've got Layne Stretton. Layne is a director at Yellow Box Careers. He's a board advisor at Roses in the Ocean. He's the chair of SALT, which is sport and life training. He's a coach, a facilitator, and he's a keynote speaker. And why I brought Layne on today is he is passionate about mental health and suicide prevention in the workplace and creating resilient work environments. So Layne, welcome. How has 2020 been for you?
Oh, hi Cam, and thanks for having me on the podcast today. 2020's been complex, hasn't it? Would that be the understatement? I think, most of us as we get towards the end of the year use that expression. Well, 2020's been an interesting year. Yes. Interesting's like the catch-all for everything that we've experienced, but how complex and how difficult has 2020 been? It's been amazing. The three areas that you just mentioned in terms of where I work, essentially they involve, senior management redundancy. There's been plenty of that. Mental health in young people, there's been a lot of that, and suicide prevention. And unfortunately, we're also seeing not so much a rise, but we're seeing some stress in that particular area as well. So 2020's been complex, interesting, and extraordinarily busy. I guess a blessing in some ways to be at work and to be working as hard as what I am because others aren't. But I also wish that maybe I wasn't working in these areas and as busy in these areas, because it would mean that maybe we're in a healthier or more resilient state. So it's been a really difficult time.
Yeah, ideally you put yourself out of a job because you get rid of some of those issues. So as you mentioned, the global pandemic has derailed a lot of plans that people set for 2020. February, March rolled around and we got hit with the coronavirus news that we would all be working from home or making some sort of change in our life. And what I saw, heard and experienced myself was going into survival mode. So you heard a lot of people talking about fight, flight, and even the freeze response, which is when people are trying to figure out what's going on and they don't know whether they need to fight or flight. So they just freeze until they've got further information. So can you talk a little bit about what happens to people when they shift from that growth mode, which they had in January and February 2020, and move into that survival mode that we saw, early March onwards?
Yeah, well, I went through this as well, as many people did. I took my family to the States in late January, early February, and we arrived back in Australia and things were different. We came back into quarantine. My son Jordan came back a week later and he went into mandatory quarantine with us. So that was the first time that we'd experienced lockdown. And then on top of that, all my work disappeared. So not only we just spent, a significant amount of money on a holiday, we come back expecting to have, a great year and to be working hard. And then all of a sudden everything was put on hold. So we all react differently to those stimulus, don't we? And one of the key drivers, I think, for the human species is survival. And in order for us to know how to survive, we need to know how to instantly respond to those different, really extreme stimulus that can hit us and can be really confronting at times. I think one of the easiest ways of explaining it is if, I'm driving down a freeway at 110 kilometers and someone cuts me off. I want to know that I have the capacity to be able to move quickly to respond to that situation, not necessarily have to think about it, not necessarily have to consider what my options are, but just instinctively move in the way that I need to. We just need to get out of the situation that we're confronting. That second tier of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is actually really important. Have you heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yep, studied it extensively at uni.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Well, that second level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is really about safety, isn't it? So once we've dealt with the physiological components, water, food, air, those sorts of things, the next thing is to protect ourselves and to make sure we're safe. And when these big stimulus happen that actually begin to have real impact on our security and our feeling of safety, Well, we have bio mechanisms to respond to that. The brain, when confronted with those situations, releases a particular chemical called cortisol. And what cortisol does is it focuses our attention on something. It forces us to look at something and react quickly to that particular threat. And so this is what happens with a lot of people when confronted with these sorts of situations. Some of us switch on.
And that cortisol is what a lot of people would know as stress, feeling stress. They feel the cortisol pump through their body, and their heart rate might go up. They kind of get that adrenaline as well, which comes through it. So how does that impact, I guess, someone's ability to think long term versus moving to that reactive mode, which you mentioned in the car example?
Yeah, well, for a lot of people, as soon as that instinct kicks in and as soon as that cortisol's released and it brings awareness to the situation, we jump into one of two responses. We either stay and fight, or we want to get out of there as fast as we possibly can. And for a lot of people, once that physical, mental, emotional response occurs, one of those two outcomes will happen. But not everybody responds in that way. And for some people, the experience that they're having can be so overwhelming, so confronting, so stimulating that it actually becomes almost impossible for them to function. And that's the freeze side of things. So on the one hand, we've got fight, that is I stay and I confront. On the other side, we've got flee, that is this is too overwhelming, too unsafe, I need to get out of here. But in the middle, we have this other section where we just literally go into this freeze mode and we really don't know what to do with the stimulus that's in front of us.
Yeah, and what's the relationship then with, I guess, the amplification of cortisol? How does that flow on through to the emotional state of people? Do you see an impact in people's emotions also being amplified?
Everything gets amplified, so the body's biomechanical reaction to this is that it amplifies everything. Our eyes get more focused, our ears hear better, our body goes into a fast twitch biomechanical kind of process. We're ready to move. Our emotions are on edge. Everything is highlighted until a point where the threat dissipates and my body can actually release that adrenaline and I can actually come down to a much more calm state. But in that moment, our body prepares us for action.
Yeah, so it's the natural performance enhancer, which obviously keeps you in that survival mode and keeps you fighting for another day. So interesting then, Layne, because it is that performance enhancer. What does a longer term duration mean on how people deal with cortisol, deal with stress, deal with uncertainty? What does that prolonged stress mean for people? And what are some of the signs they need to look out for to actually check in with themselves and understand that actually that they might not be as okay as they're putting on the front?
Yeah, it's a really important question, mate. I mean, there's two types of stress, isn't there? There's eustress and essentially there's de-stress. I mean, we spend a lot of our time in eustress, and eustress is actually a really good kind of stress because it keeps us sharp and it keeps us focused, and it makes sure that we perform when certain situations arise and we need to be able to perform. Like, for example, I might get, my heart rate might go up, I might sweat a little, and I might get a little bit more focused because I'm doing a podcast with you. But I'm certainly not overwhelmed by the situation. My body will just switch on and enable me to be able to perform, or at least I think to be able to perform in the situation. When we get to a point where we become overwhelmed by that, we go into another mode, which is called de-stress, where we find it very difficult to be able to control what it is that's happening to us. And when that extends for a significant period of time, that can actually be really damaging mentally, emotionally, and physically. I just want to touch on two things that I think are really important, which I think a lot of people are experiencing at the moment. And it's to do with loss, and it's to do with grief. A lot of people are talking about feeling, well, certainly the people that I work with in suicide prevention, mental health, a lot of young kids that we work with in sporting clubs, they're talking about doing it really tough. They're feeling angry, frustrated, they feel lost, they feel lonely. Maybe they're lacking in motivation and feeling a loss of kind of purpose. What am I doing? Where am I at the moment? When we lose something, we generally go through a grief process, but that grief process doesn't last for a long period of time. Generally speaking, we get over it pretty quickly and we then reconcile it into whatever it is that's going to happen next for us in life. But when this stress happens for a long period of time and we're experiencing a sense of grief associated with that, it can actually become really quite damaging. And it's what's called complicated grief. And it starts to have a really big impact on our emotional state. We start to really struggle with our sleep patterns. We start to think in different ways, maybe deeper thoughts, darker thoughts, maybe even some people have a little bit of suicidal ideation. It alters the way that we respond to people. It alters the way that we connect with people. It really starts to have a detrimental impact on the way that we live. The next thing that happens when we go through complicated grief is that if we can't find a way of talking about it, it develops into another form of grief, which is equally as dangerous, and that's called disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief is when I don't feel like I'm able to talk about what it is that I'm experiencing. Now, if you think about what people have gone through over the last 9 months, all of those places where they might traditionally go to talk about what it is that they're experiencing in their life have all been closed down. I might talk to my work colleagues about what's going on. Well, I can't do that because we're all on Zoom. I might talk to my football coach, my school teacher. Maybe I talk to my pastor. Maybe my dad or my mum is my closest confidant. Maybe my social network is where I go to get relief from all those things that are impacting on my life. Well, guess what? All of those are not around at the moment. And so, and the other really complicated thing that's happening for us is I understand that everybody else is going through the same process. So when I start talking about how bad I'm feeling, I actually begin to feel really guilty about that, because it's like, well, why would I load you up with all of the issues that I'm experiencing as well? So our inability to be able to talk about this actually begins to internalize a lot of this dialogue. And that comes out in dysfunctional behavior, because when we can't talk, it will come out, but generally what's going to come out will be a form of behavior that's not helpful for us. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of people at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. And one other thing I've heard, because I listen to a lot of podcasts, I do a lot of reading, was that people that were, I guess, able to move through that cycle much faster than others actually started to feel a bit of shame about being productive, about performing, about chasing success, and almost that guilt factor of, I don't know whether you call it survivor syndrome, but almost feeling guilty that they were getting ahead whilst others were, struggling to get up off the ground each day. So how do we go about changing the narrative? If someone's in that vicious cycle at the moment, they're looking to really finish off the year strongly. We've got probably about 11 weeks until the end of year. What's some practical things that people can do to start shifting to, I guess, a more positive mindset or a more positive frame of mind to finish the year strongly with some momentum?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it depends on each individual because, as you just rightly mentioned, everyone's dealing with this set of circumstances in a fundamentally different way. There are those who are, on this end of the spectrum where it is catastrophic what it is that's happening to them. And I can't imagine what it feels like to have both parents, lose a job, to be experiencing really significant mental health related issues, to be struggling with your mortgage, to be wondering where, what the future holds. I mean, it's incredibly complex, incredibly trying and difficult circumstances. And maybe if that's never happened to you before, this is a very new thing that you're going through. And then on the other end of the spectrum are those people who look at this as an opportunity for growth. There is a thing called post-traumatic growth, and it is the way that we stretch ourselves and grow and develop coming out of really complex and difficult circumstances that force us to really think about what it is that's important to us in our lives, what it is that we actually want to focus on in the future, what it is that we want to get rid of that is no longer helpful for us. and how it is that we aspire to behave at some point down the track. And there's a lot of people who actually look at these kinds of experiences and get great joy out of the growth that is going to come about as a result of it. So a lot of people at the moment are having physical impacts, insomnia, lack of sleep. Maybe they're feeling tension in their body, unhealthy coping mechanisms. We are seeing things like the statistics for self-harm in young people have gone up by about 33% in terms of accident and emergency contact. We're seeing ambulance call-outs going up to men in particular who are suffering from mental health related issues normally associated with alcohol. And so that's other things that we're seeing as a result of the lockdown, is people behaving in a more risky fashion or indulging in coping mechanisms that are not healthy and not good for them. We've got, people who, look at the rise of, the conspiracy theorists. I mean, isn't that a really interesting thing that's happened, over the last month? So much information is being fed out to us, and we've got this information that people are getting absolutely fixated and absorbed in, that's actually altering the way that they see themselves, altering the way they see the world, altering the way they see the future. I mean, it's fascinating to watch people get drawn into these incredible conspiracies like Bill Gates is ruling the world, all these sorts of interesting things. So there's a lot of things that are happening. And I love the expression that you use. I think you said, what are some of the amber lights that we need to be looking out for? Well, I think that could be summarized by saying this. If you feel like you are beginning to behave in a way which is inconsistent with either who you are or what it is that you aspire to be, that's an amber light. In other words, if you're changing and not changing in a good way, or the type of person you're trying to become is now being compromised by how you see yourself, your thought process, your emotional state, etc., then that should be a moment where you say, do I continue to go ahead, or do I stop and pause and say, what is it that's happening for me right now? And how is it that I need to shift and change in order for me to get better outcomes? And I love the expression. I don't know if you remember Dr. Phil. Do you remember Dr. Phil on the TV?
How could you forget Dr. Phil?
Dr. Phil, he was great, right? Dr. Phil had this really interesting expression where he'd talk to someone and they'd list out all the issues that are going on for them and all the problems, and he'd say, so let me ask you a question. How's that working for you? All right. He had this favorite expression. How's that working for you? All right. And essentially, that's the expression we need to ask ourselves. When we find ourselves behaving in ways that we don't understand, or we find ourselves behaving in ways that are not necessarily the way that we aspire to behave, we're going to ask ourselves, how's this working for me right now? And if it's not, what is it that I need to adjust or change in order for me to get better outcomes? And I think a lot of people are in that space at the moment where they're going through that process of self-awareness and self-reflection to understand what is it that I can do in order to get better outcomes, maybe in the short term, but more interestingly, I think, is the way that it has shaped our perspective on the world and the way that it has shaped our perspective on what we want in the future. And a lot of people are saying, I don't want to go back to the way things used to be. A lot of people are actually saying, I like this new communication. I like the way this has impacted on my family. I like the way that we're together playing board games. I like the fact that we're exercising together. I don't want to go back to working from 7 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night, not seeing my family, not investing in my relationship, not investing in myself. I'm not going to do that anymore. I want something different. And people are starting to move towards thinking in a different way. Yeah,
it's interesting you touch on that. I wrote an article earlier this week about goal setting in the context of 2020. And one of the points in that was that structures have changed from what they were at the start of the year to what they are now. And people need to start thinking about goal setting with the new structures in mind. So as you just mentioned, not thinking about planning around a 9-to-5 lifestyle where you're commuting from 7 a.m. in the office by 8 and then, continuing to work through till late at night. So why do you think goal setting is so important, especially this time of year as we kind of head into the end of the year, and we'll get to that New Year's resolution period pretty soon also. What role does goal setting play in someone's happiness?
Oh, look, I think that's a really interesting question. I also think that depends on the individual. I mean, I've got mates who are just incredible goal setters, and they set these goals and they have, yeah, this fierce determination and this incredible discipline to actually achieve their goals. Can I let you in on a little secret? I'm probably not that guy, right? I struggle with big goals, but what I have done is I've found a different way, and it still involves goals, but it's a slightly different way of looking at things. But before we go about setting goals, let's be clear on what it is that we're actually trying to do first, right? Because here's the issue: we can charge off and say, "I set this goal to do X," but if that actually isn't a goal that really feeds what it is that I'm trying to do with my life, then all I'm going to do is set myself up to potentially fail. So part of coming out of circumstances like we are and the big significant emotional events that have occurred for us is to really spend some time in reflection and ask yourself the question, what do I want? What do I really want? And I think there's a secondary question to that. And the secondary question to that is, what do I love? And let me circle back around to both those things, because they're really important questions for us to ask ourselves. The first thing that happens when we bring self-awareness to our current circumstances is we actually create this thing which we call insight. And insight's important because insight moves us from being in a state of ignorance to a state of awareness. If I never change my behavior and I never challenge my behavior, I simply continue to live in ignorance. I just do what I do. It's called the automaticity of being. And that is, I'm just being me. But the moment I stop being me and I think about whether or not this is the best version of me, and I start to realize what's happening to me and what it means to me, is the moment where I develop insight. And out of insight comes knowledge. And when we have knowledge, with knowledge comes new skills, new capabilities, new behaviors that I've acquired through my experiences. And I'm now able to use that knowledge to feed the next phase of the process, and that is wisdom. And when I have wisdom, this is where I begin to understand what it is that I want in my life, not only for my betterment, but also for the betterment of others that are around me. And so at this point, we're ready to start building goals. So the first thing I'm going to say to people is, if you want to go on a goal setting process, and I really would encourage you to do so, have a think about what you want. And in order to do that, spend some time in reflection and build awareness around what it is that's important to you. Because if you don't know what's important to you, how is it that you can set goals that are actually meaningful, that are going to give you what it is ultimately that you want? And so this is the way that I like people to start. So circle back around to the two questions. What do you want and what do you love? What you want sets direction. What you love tells you what's important. You know, I talked to someone, might have been 5 years ago. I was talking to a guy and we were chatting about values, right? This oft used expression in organizations, right? You know what? And I said to him, I said, do you have a definition for me as to how to explain what a value is for a human being? And he thought about it for a moment and he said, when was the last time that you felt angry? And I remember thinking about that and saying to him, it was something to do with, something that happened at home and one of my kids, and I got very angry about that particular situation. He said, okay. He said, when was the last time you felt joy? And I also thought about that, and I remembered that it was the Christmas previous, where I was sitting around the table, and it was Christmas lunch, and I had my 3 kids there, my wife and I. It was just the 5 of us. And the first time in about 10 years that we had Christmas together just as a family. And I remember feeling a great sense of joy and contentment. And so I explained those two situations to him. And he said this, he said, when you feel something, great joy or great anger or disappointment, it tells you where the line is. It tells you what's important to you, because you only get angry if a line's been crossed, and you only feel great joy if you are achieving what it is that you want to achieve and it's making you happy. So what I'd say to people is think about what's important. Think about what lights you up. Think about what brings you energy, all of those wonderful energies like joy and peace and happiness and contentment. Think about those things and then say to yourself, what is it that I need to do? What is it I need to have? Or what is it that I need to have happen around me that is going to help me to actually get what it is that I want? And once you understand what you aspire to, then it's a case of now starting to set the goals in order to go out and achieve that. Now, I'm not a big goal setter, so I want to simplify this for people if I can. There's a guy called Sir David Brailsford. Sir David Brailsford ran the Sky Racing team and the British Olympic cycling team. And he came up with this idea, and it was called the aggregation of marginal gains. And what he said was this: we shouldn't look at performance as being big steps, but we should look at performance as being lots of subtle changes in lots of different places in order for us to get a cumulative impact. There's also an expression that was written when the Berlin Wall came down. It was written on the Berlin Wall, and I've always remembered and loved this expression. It says this: it says, lots of small people in lots of small places doing lots of small things can change the world. And so my advice to people is, when you set goals, set small ones that are achievable, but set them in lots of different places so that you get the cumulative effect of achievement in lots of different ways. If you want to get fit, don't just focus on going to the gym and lifting big weights. If you want to get fit, focus on small incremental changes you might make to your nutrition, incremental changes you might make to the way you deal with alcohol, with your hydration. Maybe you want to walk a little bit more as well. Maybe you want to just walk the stairs at the office instead of taking the lift. Make subtle, small changes. And oftentimes, without you knowing it, the changes in all those little areas become really big and help you to achieve ultimately much larger goals. So that's my advice in terms of setting goals.
Yeah, it rings true for me, Layne. I like to call it a personal promise each day, that you create a personal promise, you fulfill that promise, and you tick it off at the end of the day to say, I achieved at least one thing for the day. Ideally, you've got 3, 4, 5 things that compound over time, but you get into the habit of winning. You get into the habit of having momentum on your side and feeling good because you're actually achieving progress. So that's some really good insights there. So Layne, I'm conscious of your time and I know you need to run. So if you were to leave those tuning in with one final piece of advice, a practical tip or something that can really help them to finish off the year strongly and set up for success in 2021, what would your advice be?
Well, the first thing I'd say to people is just sit down, quieten your mind, take a big breath. We are going to get through this. We are going to come out the other side of this more resilient, stronger, more connected than we ever were. So the first thing I want people to do is just to breathe their way through the next period of time. The second thing that I'd love people to do is to rethink what it is that's important to them, to really establish what this entire process has taught them about their values and about the way that they want to live their life, and then begin the process of setting small targets to move them closer and closer towards the person that they aspire to be. And I think if we can all find that post-traumatic growth, and if we can all find little ways of being better human beings, being better to ourselves and being better to others that are around us, well, I think the world would be a better place as a result.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Layne. And thanks very much for taking the time to chat with me today on the Camera is On initiative. If those that have tuned in have found some value from this, please leave a comment. Please hit the like button, share it with a friend or family member that you think it might help, and also drop me a message as to some future topics that you'd like to see covered. So thanks again, Layne. Really appreciate your contribution.
Cam, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, mate.